Okay. So we're going to go ahead and dive in. You guys, like I said, feel free to pause me on anything that you want to discuss a little bit more. And any additional questions that you might have. So we're just going to walk through the purchase agreement. I have one pulled up here. It was just faster to get this than a blank one. So going right through things, obviously, I think that this is pretty self-explanatory. We have the buyer's names that go here. Do you guys all have in, what's the word I'm looking for? Your templates set up in Instinet?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And do you guys go into the actual MLS listing and click Instinet there to start your purchase agreements?
I do.
Yes.
Okay. Just some agents don't. And I feel like that is a huge time saver since it inputs, some of the information in for you. And obviously then you can add your contacts, et cetera. But it sounds like you guys already got that. Okay. Next section is the earnest money. Obviously the amount that you're.
Kassie, sorry, one thing. Yeah. I know we had talked about this when we were doing this purchase agreement, but just to be sure. So when we do the purchase agreement, is it best practice to always put the name of the person who's going to be getting the loan or the financing for it? Or do you put both names? I know you had said that it was, you put the name of the person who is approved for the financing, and then you can cross that bridge when you come to it if you have to add in the other person.
Yep. And here's why. So for the longest time, it used to always be that lenders only wanted the buyer who is approved for financing on the purchase agreement, right? And then title would just add them at closing. And I would actually had experiences with banks, if you put two people on the purchase agreement and only one was approved, that they wanted the other removed. Well, now recently I've actually been experiencing where lenders are allowing that. So, and we didn't follow up on this. That was a great question. I'm glad you brought it up. The answer is talk to the lender.
Okay.
Because eventually title is going to want an amendment stating that that individual is being added to title.
Okay.
So a good rule of thumb is I would always just put, either talk to the lender, or I would always just put whoever's approved for the loan as the buyer.
Okay, great.
All right, next section is earnest money. One thing I do want to point out is it says to have it delivered no later than 2 days after final acceptance date. This is important. So we recently had one where it got to closing, and long story short, the earnest money was never deposited. EXP then got involved, and they were like pretty upset with the agent because that's a finable offense. So make sure that you are doing this earnest money, and it stinks because with trust funds, you send the link, you're not really in control of when the buyer does it, right? I mean, the only control we have is continuing following up with them and reminding them that per the purchase agreement, this was their timeline. But technically you're out of contract if it's not submitted, and a seller could deliver a cancellation. The other thing is, you guys might notice, and I can't remember if anybody on this call has used them, the earnest money receipt document. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Do not ever use that form unless you as the agent have physically received a written earnest money check from the client. If you fill out that form and you didn't receive that check, that's also a finable offense with the Department of Commerce. You
don't need it at all?
Nope.
Oh, okay. I put it in every purchase agreement, so that's good to know.
Yeah, so that's actually a funny one because, again, depending on who you learned that from, like if you learned it from someone who has probably been in the industry a little while, like I have been, trust funds, guys, is relatively new. Fun fact, the individual who started trust funds, I helped her dial in the program. So before it was even like out in public and it was just in like in its inception phases. I had a lot of meetings with her on like what would work for agents, what wouldn't work for agents. So our trust funds and that process is probably only like 7-8 years old. So before that, our only option was written checks, which is why that earnest money receipt became a thing, because we would indicate that we had the check in our hand when we submitted the purchase agreement. The problem is that document is stating that you as the agent received the check. So if you're submitting it with a purchase agreement and you didn't really receive a check, it's kind of like fraud, if you will. I mean, that's probably a pretty harsh word. I only bring this up because I had an agent with my previous brokerage. I think you guys all know who that was. Maybe you didn't, but it's not a very well respected brokerage within the industry. And so we always had the other side trying to find any reason that they could to like report us. And an agent of ours over there had submitted the earnest money receipt, kind of like you do, Lydia, just because they thought that that was best practice. He had never received a check. The agent on the other side turned him in and he got like a $1,500 fine for that.
Wow.
So, again, these are things that they don't teach you in real estate school. And, even in my like, other training video, I don't go into a lot of detail on these like minor things. So and I shouldn't say minor. I mean, that's a huge fine. But so stop using that, Lydia.
Okay. Number 7, then I put trust funds and check that box. Is that fine?
You're not supposed to do that either. So that is also
I'm
something
doing all the wrong things.
Yep. So that is something I used to also do. And I had a real estate attorney tell me, no, if checked, that box is indicating, okay, so if we read it here, it says $7,500 shall be delivered to listing broker, or if checked to. So this is where you would check it. Okay. I always look in the MLS to see if that trust funds, if the other side is part of trust funds, because if they're not, I will check this box and put delivered to buyer's broker. Because I don't want to have to deliver a check. Now, trust funds again has evolved. So it used to be that you couldn't use trust funds. How do I say this? Well, almost every brokerage is part of trust funds now. I feel like it's very rare that I run into a brokerage on the other side that isn't approved through trust funds. But sometimes there's the smaller brokerages that aren't. And secondly, trust funds, now you have the option to check whether it's going to be sitting with the listing broker or the buyer broker. That used to not be an option either. So anyway, to answer your question, Lydia, this is actually by checking that box, you're indicating who the earnest money is delivered to. Trust funds isn't a holder of money. They're a vessel to get the money. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So you're mainly saying we check that box if, for instance, it was a different situation where the buyer's broker was going to hold the earnest money and not the listing broker.
Correct. Yep.
I've never used it, so I've never checked that box.
And is that something to know how to fill that out? Like you said, you go into MLS, see if it talks about trust funds. Aside from that, then do you can also have conversation with the list or conversation with the other listing agent or the other agent to be able to make sure have agreement of where it goes?
I mean, you can upfront, right? But like, if I was delivering this purchase agreement and I went into trust funds and found out that they weren't part of trust funds and I had this checked, I mean, it's kind of their responsibility to read the purchase agreement and indicate that that's where it's going, right?
Okay.
The funny thing about trust funds is or the funny thing about earnest money is it really doesn't matter who holds it.
Okay.
Older agents, I shouldn't say that. Agents who've been in the industry for a long time, think it's a big deal. And I don't know if years ago it was different. right now, the reason it doesn't matter who holds the earnest money is because neither brokerage can do anything with that earnest money without written direction that's signed by all parties. Right. So like it used to be a big deal, like if you just, I'm only explaining this because if you ever run into a listing agent who's like, absolutely not, my firm is holding it,
Mhm.
but challenge them on why.
I've
Because-
had one and I had to physically deliver it to him, a paper check.
Oh,
Like,
Um,
gosh.
yeah, it really doesn't matter. And I think because maybe back in the day, when purchase agreements weren't as ironclad as they are now, and maybe processes weren't as ironclad as they were, maybe like in the 90s, I don't know. But perhaps it mattered because the listing broker could just decide to release it, right? Like maybe that's why it mattered. Whereas now, or it's just uneducated agents, but literally just because EXP is holding it or Edina is holding it, it doesn't mean that if the transaction goes sideways, that the brokerage that's holding the earnest money can just feel like, oh, I feel like this person deserves it, so I'm going to release it to them. They can't at all. The only way the earnest money can be released is through a purchase agreement, and we're heading to closing, or a cancellation being signed and the earnest money being directed to where it goes, or thirdly, by a court order. So that's just important for you to know, like, if you guys ever represent a listing and, because I've had sellers ask that before too, say something weird like, well, we're keeping the earnest money and you guys are holding on to it, so you can just deliver it to us. No, it doesn't work like that.
So if you're in a purchase agreement that says you get the earnest money back, how does that happen then? Once, like, say they go through inspection and find something they didn't like, how does that transpire and how long does it take to get it back?
So that's another interesting. I was actually just talking with Sarah Church this morning because she had a signed cancellation over a month ago and her buyers never received the earnest money back. And an interesting thing is there is no statute on how long a brokerage has to return earnest money once the cancellation's been signed. The state like statute is just in a timely manner. Well, that's what's the word I'm looking for? What's timely to you and what's timely to the other party is two different things, right? So 30 days is, I definitely could argue that that's not in a timely manner. And this is actually starting to turn into a much bigger issue that we can save for another day. But Chris, once the cancellation is signed by all parties, they turn it in. And typically I would say most brokerages start the process of refunding that within like 24 to 48 hours.
Do they refund it back the same way it was paid, or
Typically they're supposed to. I recently, again, there's nothing that states they have to. And I recently ran into a company who said they had no way to return it via wire and they had to send a check. To me, it sounded like an accounting department who didn't know what they were doing at that brokerage's organization. But we were kind of done fighting the whole fact and just wanted to get the buyer's earnest money back. So they sent a check.
makes sense?
Yeah. So to your point, let's say in this purchase agreement, okay, in the purchase agreement, for example, it says that, if they cancel because of the inspection, they get their earnest money back, right? Well, let's say the seller refuses to sign the cancellation for one reason or another. That's back to my point. Just because the purchase agreement states that it's refunded to buyer, the brokerage that's holding that earnest money cannot release it without a cancellation signed by all parties agreeing to where that earnest money is going to go. So in that case, the buyers would actually have to hire an attorney to get their earnest money back.
I
Does that
would
make
think that's rare, though. I would think that
Yeah,
most people would agree to it.
it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare, but crazy things happen. Maybe one party dies in this and you can't get a cancellation signed. Believe it or not, I've been a part of like probably half a dozen scenarios like that. And the party has to go to court and get what's called a statutory cancellation. Even, well, this is going too far into the weeds, but cancellation has to be signed by all parties directing where earnest money goes. Do you guys have any other questions about earnest money? This is great. I didn't want to just sit here and bore you guys to death going through this, so I like the questions.
Earnest money is always 1% of the sale price, right?
No,
No, okay,
it doesn't have to be. Earnest
doesn't
money
have
can
to
be
be.
whatever amount you want it to be. For example, like VA buyers are typically no money down.
right,
So they like to put as little earnest money down. Like a lot of times I have VA buyers that only put $500 down.
Oh, so
Okay.
there's no minimum they need to put down? Cause I'm
No.
working with a VA buyer and they don't have much money right now.
Yeah, I've actually done as low as 250.
Oh, okay, well, that's good to know.
Granted, do sellers like to see more?
Yeah, right.
Obviously, because I mean, it doesn't, $250 isn't much to them if the buyer backs out, but there is no, I mean, Jen, that's a good rule of thumb. And I think it's kind of what
Okay.
you're taught in school. And that's kind of the rule of thumb that the majority of agents go by. But
okay,
there is no set requirement
okay,
minimum. And sometimes you'll see in listings, like in the MLS that they'll say, you know, X amount of earnest money required.
oh,
If a
sure, yes,
buyer,
I've seen that, sure.
if a buyer does ask though, cause I've had multiple ask, how much should we put down for earnest money? What's like a, a good answer?
I would say that 1% rule.
Okay,
I would
Okay.
say, generally, it's pretty typical that we see 1%.
got it.
And then, I always remind people like, hey, your earnest money is typically going to be refundable to you if you don't go through, the inspection or you can't get financing. And it also goes towards your closing costs. You know what I mean? So if the lender had told them they needed to bring $10,000 to closing and they put $5,000 in earnest money, well, at closing, you're only going to bring $5,000. Not everybody understands that. I feel like earnest money is a really hard thing for buyers to wrap their heads around.
It is. And I think sometimes too, they think, which I understand is, it's like, well, what happens if we have to cancel? I don't want to risk like putting 3% down versus 1.
Yeah, I just say, look, earnest money is your good faith effort to the seller that you plan on following through with this transaction.
Yeah, a lot of times I relate it to property management. I said, it's kind of like when you get a apartment, they just want to know that you're committed and serious about the offer and, putting that forth.
Right. And I
Is
think that's fair.
Is the right way to talk about earnest money, the right phrasing to say that it goes toward your closing costs, or that it goes off the actual price of your home, like the sale price of your home? Because that's how I always thought it was, the terminology to use is that it comes right off the top of then what your sale price of the home is going to be. But is it more so you say it comes off of your closing costs? I just want to be
I actually typically just say whatever amount the lender said you need to bring to closing,
okay.
because
Okay. Got it. Okay.
It's just typically what I say.
Sure. That's
Whatever
great. I
amount-
just want to make sure to, use consistent and accurate terminology. So
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah.
And I mean,
I
I think,
usually just tell them that it's held in escrow until they're closing and serves as a credit on their settlement statement.
yeah. Yeah, because I mean, whether it's closings cost or it's down payment.
Yeah. And I
You know.
think keeping it, some of my clients, like I've learned, try to get not too wordy. Some of them, I think, like your high level phrasing, Kassie, was really good. And Chris, like that was a really good explanation too. But
Yeah.
like for some of them, I think if I could just say whatever, whatever you're going to pay at closing or whatever you're supposed to bring to closing, it comes off of that.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
And just kind of
Earnest
keep
money
it high
is your-
level.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Next section is obviously the property address and the legal description. The rest of this is kind of everything that's included in the sale, right? Bulbs, plants, shrubs. I mean, it's crazy. Yeah, I've seen crazy things where people, a little off topic, but we had these buyers once that closed in the middle of winter. And in spring and summer, when they started doing landscaping, these sellers over the years must not have had trash service, and they buried their garbage throughout the yard.
Gross.
Crazy, right? One thing I do like to point out in here is a couple of things. TV wall mounts are included in here. So I always, if I'm working with a seller and I'm doing a walkthrough on their house, I let them know like, hey, TV wall mounts are something that stays because it's attached. So if that's something that you want to keep with you or bring with you, then either let's take the TV down before we go live, or we need to remember that we exclude it in the purchase agreement at the time of the offer.
Okay.
And then it says, and the following if built in: dishwashers, refrigerators, wine and beverage refrigerators, et cetera, et cetera. This is another one that it's like, well, what's considered built in, right? Like
Mhm.
my dishwasher, there's a spot in my kitchen that was made for that dishwasher, but it's not technically built in because it's not attached to anything. So that's why, also in this section, conventional loans do not care what you put in these two areas. FHA does not want any personal property included on the purchase agreement, and they consider things like fridge, dishwasher, oven, etc. as personal property. And I point this out because if you were to include that in here, you're probably going to have the lender reach out to you and ask you to remove that from the purchase agreement, and then you have to draft an amendment. So I think you guys are all good at using the personal property agreement, right?
Mhm.
That's why you need that. And because I think it leaves up, there's some discretion involved as to whether these appliances are built in. That's why I always just include a personal property agreement and I check all of those items. Does that make sense?
Kathy, I put on line 33, all appliances as seen on like the day I showed it.
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, that's another thing that's taught. But how are you going to prove what's seen on that day?
Yeah, that's fair.
So I do know agents who take pictures of appliances when they're showing the home. So that they could prove it. Again, it's not wrong of you to put that in there, but like, if it really push came to shove, how are you going to prove what was seen on that day?
The listing photos wouldn't be enough.
Well, that's what I was gonna say. We have won these cases with, going into the listing photos and seeing what was on there. I also know agents who get very specific on the personal property agreement and will put like GE washer and dryer, Samsung fridge, and literally, because there have been instances where sellers, will try to swap out their nice fridge for a crappier one or what have you. This is probably an area that I see causing the most expense to agents. I cannot tell you how many washer and dryer sets I know agents have purchased for people. And that could be a matter of, so I had a listing, seller didn't want the washer and dryer to convey. They wanted to take their washer and dryer with them. They did. I had it put on the MLS. Buyer went to do the final walkthrough and the agent called me and said, where the heck are the washer and dryer? And I said, you didn't include it in the purchase agreement. they weren't real happy with me, but that was,
And you disclosed that it wasn't included?
I put in the MLS that it wasn't included, but another interesting fact about the MLS is the only thing guaranteed in the MLS is buyer broker compensation.
Oh,
So I share that as well because I had another listing once that I had in agent remarks that seller was willing to replace the carpet upon acceptable offer to seller. Okay. The offer was written and we agreed and got through inspection, and the buyer's agent went to do their final walkthrough and said, hey, you said you were replacing all the carpet in here. I said, you didn't put that in the purchase agreement. How was I to know that the buyers wanted that? Again, that agent wasn't very happy with me. And luckily, like I, contacted the sellers and was like, hey, they expected this, even though they didn't put it in the purchase agreement. You technically don't have to do anything because it wasn't a full price offer that we had agreed upon. Right. And so we weren't committing the sellers to, I had said, with an offer acceptable to sellers because, you don't want to be committed to them replacing carpet if the offer is $50,000 low. Right. So long story short, my sellers were super nice, reasonable people, and they ended up giving some money towards carpet. They actually gave them Home Depot gift cards, which I had to close my ears on because technically no money should exchange hands between buyers and sellers. That's not on the Alta or closing statement. But I kind of just, they exchanged a gift card at the end of the day. So again, these are the things being included or excluded in purchase agreements are where I see costing agents the most amount of money because a buyer was expecting something that wasn't there, or the seller had planned on taking something that wasn't there, or seller tries to switch out appliances. So yeah, Lydia, there's nothing wrong with saying as seen on. It just, what if the pictures are taken down off the MLS? How are you going to prove that? And it's fine to continue doing that for conventional, but if you keep doing that for FHA and the lender hasn't called you out on it, expect one day for that to happen, for them to want that removed from the purchase agreement. So that's why I just don't do anything here, and I do everything on a personal property agreement.
Basically, we should just do a personal property agreement on any purchase agreement and get in the habit of it.
Yep.
but on the personal property agreement itself, because this verbiage is in there, you don't certainly have to go kind of down that rabbit hole of including all of that, but you do want to check those microwave, freezer, like
Yeah.
those main things. What are maybe some of the other, because you check that other box. I know that I've had a couple, where it's been clear what you call out in the other, because it's been something in the MLS saying that would be offered to, like a pool table, for instance,
Yep.
to be offered to the
So-
buyer. But what other kind of things do you recommend putting in the other?
They're
Let's
really,
do
I mean, again, it's going to be a case by case basis. I've seen, custom chairs that were built for a breakfast bar.
Okay.
Goats, believe it or not, cars. I've kind of seen it all.
Okay.
Riding lawnmowers, like it would just, anything and everything that a buyer might be asking or a seller is wanting to convey with the property, put it in there.
And that's not included in this like big paragraph kind of thing. So it's not redundant.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
One quick question before you move on.
Sure.
What about like, excuse me, like a swing set or something like that? If the buyer doesn't want it, but the seller wants to leave it, they still have to remove it, right?
Well, everything's negotiable and what is in the contract, right? So if the buyers didn't want it, I would put that in the other section of this PA.
Okay.
Makes sense.
So I would down here, right in here, seller to remove swing set prior to closing. That's something I get a little, with the market being as crazy it's been the last couple years though, like I'll tell buyers, like, do you really want to, if you're facing multiple offers, do you want to put something like that in the purchase agreement? And maybe they pick another offer because they don't have to remove the swing set prior to closing. Right? Like you kind of got to think about that. Like you don't want to lose an offer over something as minor as that. Like, wouldn't you rather just keep the swing set there and then you can sell it on marketplace in the spring? So just make sure you kind of have those conversations with them as well.
Okay, sounds good.
But yeah, make sure you include, because again, anything that's not in the purchase agreement will not hold up in court. So it doesn't matter what conversation you and the listing agent have. It doesn't matter what's stated in the MLS. What the courts are going to look at is what was put in writing on this purchase agreement that was signed by the parties. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think I'm learning a little bit more just from that, with the appliances and everything else with the personal property, because I don't do that all the time, so it's good information.
Yeah. And it takes one time to buy clients a washer and dryer. You know what I mean? Like, hopefully none of you guys ever have to do that. I'll be honest with you, it'll probably happen in your career at some point or another. Because I just feel like nobody comes out of every transaction unscathed. I had another circumstance when we get to the inspection piece where I accidentally checked buyer is doing a home inspection, but then I checked is not contingent on the results of it. I checked the wrong box. So we did the inspection, buyer wanted to ask for a few things. I sent it over to the listing agent. Listing agent pretty much laughed in my face. I realized what my mistake was. There was high radon in the property. So I always joke that I'm the proud owner of a radon mitigation system for a property I've never lived in. And that cost me like $1,500.
I was gonna say, how much did that cost? Oh,
Yeah. Interesting piece to that. I was working with a radon guy that I had actually sent a ton of business to. So he was like, look, Cassie, I will install this mitigation system to you at cost. So just the cost of everything. So it was only like $500 for the actual things. However, he had to hire an electrician to go up into the attic to put an outlet in for the fan. And that was the majority of my expense on that. It was almost $1,000 for that electrician to do that. Which that's a story in of itself, but all right. Is stories like that helpful for you guys? It's really
Yes.
how I learned. So that's why I share so many stories, because that's what resonates with me, but I don't want to bore you guys to death.
No, it is
no, you're not
helpful.
boring me at all. It's
Very
actually very
helpful.
interesting.
Okay, good. All right. And we might, because I don't want to keep you guys, I want to be respectful of your time. So this may turn into 2 sessions because it's taking a little bit longer than I thought it would, but this is good stuff, right? I don't want to rush us through it either. If these are the questions that you have, let's get through them. So we can just get what we can get through today, and we'll pick this up next week. All right, next section, purchase price. I feel like that's pretty self-explanatory. The cash and mortgage financing. Do you guys have any questions on these?
Do those figures there have to be precise? Like,
No.
just doing 2080 is okay. I just want to make sure because I knew, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, not, I mean, try and be as accurate as possible, but like, I don't literally do the math and be like,
Okay.
oh, they're putting 18% down. Like, if I knew that, I would just put 15, right?
Okay.
Closing date shall be, okay, next section, mortgage financing.
Question on closing date. If the buyer, like in my case with this purchase agreement, the buyer didn't really have a specified closing date that they kind of wanted to shoot for or hit. And it certainly wasn't like specified from the seller that they want a quick close. So do you, as a general rule of thumb, do you just kind of do 45 days,
Yep.
50 days?
So in my buyer consults, I tell people typical closing date is about 45 days from the purchase agreement. And the
Right.
reason for that is because it's typically about how long the lender needs.
Right.
Actually, lenders need about 30 days, but then we have an inspection period in there, and most lenders don't start that process until you get through inspection.
Okay.
So if buyers didn't have a choice, I would call sellers and I would ask if they had a closing
Right.
date they would prefer, and if they don't, then I'm just gonna throw 45 days on it.
Okay, thank you.
Another thing I like to point out on closing dates though, actually, is I don't ever pick a Friday.
I remember you mentioning that.
Yep, I always do Thursdays, or another day in the week. The reason for that is because if something happens the day of closing, which happens more than any of us would like to admit or think, maybe the lender doesn't get the package, etc. If your closing date was for a Friday, guess what? Nobody works on the weekends in title and lending. So now you're not closing till Monday. And these poor buyers probably had people lined up, moving trucks
Right.
scheduled, all of these things. It can cost them thousands of dollars if that gets pushed back. So I always pick Thursdays or the day before, and I explain to my buyer why. Because look, if any delay happens that day, we're still going to be able to get you closed the next day then, hopefully, and you can move on with your moving plans for the weekend.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Mortgage financing. So most oftentimes, it is going to be contingent unless you get one of those lucky people who has cash, which I cannot believe the last few years, how many buyers had cash. I don't know where people get their money, but, I would like some of it, please. So typically it is contingent, right? And then you have first mortgage and subordinate financing. First mortgage and subordinate financing would be checked if they're using something like Minnesota Housing, Minnesota Finance, any kind of down payment assistance program.
Okay. Okay.
But in this case, there was just a first mortgage and they were doing conventional financing. All right, next section, 30 years and an interest rate no more than. So here's another thing. And Jen, was this yours as well, that the agent responded back and they wanted you to put at market in there?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yep.
So a lot of agents were taught to do at market here. I say no way, because what if rates take a ridiculous hike in the next 30 days over this time frame, right? So let's say a buyer is buying a $250,000 townhome, they're approved at 6% interest, and their mortgage payment's going to be $1,300. Those numbers are probably way wrong. We're just talking hypothetically here, right? So that's what they're approved for. They're totally okay with that. Well, then 2 weeks from now, mortgage rates go up to 15%. And the buyer's still qualified because they make enough money. But now the buyer's like, well, I liked that $250,000 townhome on a $1,300 a month payment, but I don't like that townhome at a $1,900 a month payment.
Mhm.
So if we would have put at market there, Jen, and those rates took a hike and the buyer still qualified, they're stuck.
Right.
Versus if you put this ceiling on here, and rates take a ridiculous hike, the buyer has an out.
Mhm.
Does that make sense, you guys?
So what
Yeah,
do we
you
put at
usually-
that line?
Do you
Well-
usually do like a half a point or a point above whatever it's at now?
I usually do about 2 points above.
Okay.
Technically, you should be talking to your buyer about this because it's really what their comfort level is, right? But sometimes that's going too far. What I typically do is I put 2 points above wherever they're approved at. And then when I'm reviewing the purchase agreement with them, I explain that in this section. I pretty much explain it to them just the way I explained it to you. Hey, you know what your payment's going to be at this interest rate. We want to protect you in the instance that rates took a crazy hike. And look, I've never seen that happen that dramatically, like I just talked about, overnight or even over a 30-day time frame. But like we never know, right? Like if we all of a sudden we're at war with another, like, there's just so many things that can happen that affect rates that are completely out of any of our control.
Yeah, and I explaining that to my buyers in this case, we did go with 8.5 per your suggestion, Cassie.
Yeah.
But I really had to talk them through that a couple different times in a couple
Yep.
different ways, because they were worried that basically I was trying to lock them into a higher rate, or saying
Yep.
that they should be paying. And it's like, no, this is more of a protective thing for you.
Yeah, it is. It is
So it's
really
kind of hard to get through that part a little
It
bit.
is a really hard one to get through. It's just like earnest money. Buyers are kind of like, and so that's where really saying, hey, you're going to lock in your interest rate with your lender.
With your lender, right?
So the rate you end up getting, what this here is to protect you in the event that rates became very unsteady over the next couple months.
Right.
So how did the agent react when you said no?
She was totally fine with that. She was fine with it. Yeah.
But like I understood why she also necessarily wasn't comfortable with the 7.5 because rates are hovering right around there, right?
Right.
So that could have given the buyers an out, which that's why I feel like that
Yes.
2 points is fair.
Yep. Right. And being naive. So when I did this purchase agreement, they were pre-approved at 7.5% / 7.836%. And so I can now when you explain that to me, I can really understand where from the listing agent's perspective, well, if it's past you're pre-approved for 7.5, and if it gets
Right.
7.5, we have no deal,
Right.
or they could back out. So
Right. Which is why, again, I think that 2
makes
points is kind of fair because it likely isn't going to cross that threshold.
right.
What happens if the listing agent wants market there? Then what?
So what I had Jen tell them is absolutely not, my broker will not allow that.
Yep.
Okay.
And she was fine with it.
So I would just say our broker says, that we need to have a number in there that's chosen by the buyer. Because
Right.
at market is not in their best interest and can really put them in a situation. To be honest with you, that's one of the first times I've heard an agent counter back with that. But again, Jen, I think in her eyes, she was looking at this going, well, that's what they're approved at. So there's
Agreed.
not much
Yes. That
wiggle
was,
room.
yes. Yep.
But you will see at market still frequently in here. And I feel again, that that's from some older school agents who've been in the industry for a long time. And that's all that they've ever done. Cause I know that there's agents on our team that still do that as well.
That's what I was taught and what I've been doing.
Yep. Do you understand though, why that could be,
Yeah, it makes sense.
not in their best interest and could really put them in a predicament?
Yeah.
Because if they still qualify, the only
Right.
way that they could get out of financing is if the lender provides a denial letter. And a fun fact about that, lenders cannot willy-nilly provide denial letters. They cannot just provide a denial letter because the buyer doesn't want to move forward with the purchase of this anymore. The lender has to have a reason to provide a denial letter, which a reason would be because they no longer qualify. An interest rate hike is no longer a reason unless it literally puts them out of their debt to income ratios.
And if the rate would, so in this case, I put 8.5, let's say the rate did go to like 9% or 8.75. Does that mean it is still up to the buyer's discretion if they want to move forward? Okay, so it doesn't automatically cancel anything or?
Nope.
Okay.
No, it would just be at their discretion. Like, are they still comfortable with that payment and want to move forward? If the answer is yes, then, there's nothing stating that the purchase agreement is canceled.
Okay, great.
All right. Any other questions on that? Okay, next section is mortgage financing contingency. So funny enough, prior to like 2019, nobody ever saw anything but this box being checked. It was always this box, and then it was always refunded to buyer. So this just basically says, hey, if they can't get financing by the closing date, purchase agreement's canceled. Buyer and seller shall sign a cancellation and earnest money shall be retained, refunded to buyer or forfeited to seller. But once the market got crazy, that's when people started checking the second box, which I think you guys might all know this, maybe you don't. These all changed in August. How this purchase agreement looks changed in August. And I'm finding a lot of people are having a hard time wrapping their brains around this one. So let's get through this section and then we'll close out today and we'll pick up where we left off next week. Sound good?
Yes.
Okay. So the next section is basically stating that a written statement will be provided by the date that you identify in here. I, as default, typically do a week before closing. However, if I'm doing a 30-day closing, I'm going to call the lender to make sure that they can, because you're really committing the lender here, right?
Yeah, I had, sorry to interrupt you. I had a lender just call and kind of bite my head off because it was 30 days and she said that's not enough time.
Yeah.
I had to push financing back.
Yep. So I typically, I mean, as a good rule of thumb, I would always ask the lender. But if I have like a 60 or 90-day close for one reason or another, I'm pretty confident with my week before closing, right? But if it's anything less than like 45 days, guys, I would call the lender.
If you can't call the lender, because like, for instance, when the 2 purchase agreements that I've written for my buyers, it's always on a Friday at 6:00 at night, can you just still go through? Is it best practice? I mean, I don't want to wait because of course, if you're going into multiples and things like that, you want to be in at the right time, but how do you handle that then if you can't get a hold of the lender and it's a quick close and that kind of thing?
So another good rule for you guys to follow is when you start working with buyers to hop on the phone with the lender.
Yeah.
Before you even write your first purchase agreement and say, anything I need to know about this buyer, anything specifically I need to include in the purchase agreement about financing, seller pays, and oh, by the way, when I go to write an offer, how long do you need for a written statement? Then you kind of know ahead of time, right? But in this case, where you didn't know to do that, you didn't think to do that, and it's a Friday evening and you can't get a hold of the lender, I'd do a week before closing.
Okay.
Can you check box 73 refunded to buyer and also check 76?
No, because, and that's another mistake I'm glad you brought that up. That's another mistake that's frequently done. Line 73 is specifically for if box 70 is checked. Okay. So if you're not checking box 70, nothing in 73 should be checked. Now, here's where you're discussing, I'm pointing at this like you guys can see where I'm pointing. 107 and 111 is the same as line 73, but it's specific to having checked box 76. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I've been making that mistake a few times. I think I checked 70 and 76, and then I would get a amendment saying I should uncheck 70.
Yep. So it's one or the other. You either check box 70, in which case you'll be checking box 73, or you check neither of those and you check box 76.
And
But
that is,
from what you stated earlier, we shouldn't be checking 70 and 73, correct?
Well, I mean, it's become the norm.
Okay.
It's really become the norm to get this written statement. And I think it's going to continue to be the norm, you guys. I honestly doubt we're going to see a whole lot of section 70 going forward. I think that this is one of those things that is part of the crazy market. It's just going to be something that sticks.
Well, I've had a first-time home buyer when I checked 76 and then put a week before closing who freaked out about it because they were like, oh my gosh, what happens if we don't have the written statement by that date? And I said, well, you know, honestly, they want to close on this. And I would think that, you know, it's rare that they would cancel a purchase agreement if we didn't have written statement by that date. Is that true?
So this is where, this is where these were all changed in August. So it used to just say, you know, it would just basically say that a written statement needed to be delivered by such and such date. And if it wasn't, it was the seller's responsibility to call that and submit a cancellation, right? And if a seller didn't, nothing happened. And you're right, it's fair to say that, like, if you're getting that close to closing and a written statement isn't delivered, is the seller really going to cancel? That being said, it didn't indicate where earnest money was to go in that event, which is why they added, as of August of last year, these different things indicating where earnest money will go should the written statement not be delivered. Okay, so let's read through this. The written statement means a written statement prepared by the buyer's mortgage originator or lender after the final acceptance date that buyers approve for the loan specified in this purchase agreement, including both the first mortgage and any subordinate financing, if any, and stating that an appraisal satisfactory to the lender has been completed, and stating conditions required by lenders to close the loan. Upon delivery of the written statement to seller, the obligation for satisfying all conditions required by the mortgage originator or lenders, except those conditions specified below, are deemed accepted by buyer. So any work orders that are to be completed by seller, any financing terms agreed to be completed by seller, and any contingency for the sale and closing of a buyer's property. So that's in there because even if the lender provides a written statement date, it still has to be, you know, that other property still has to close. So if that property fell through, the written statement isn't going to obligate them to still move forward. Does that make sense? Guys, I feel like I was might have been a little muddy on that.
I think it does make sense.
Okay. So basically, if your buyer had a home sale contingency and the lender provided a written statement stating that their loan's still approved, it can still have the condition of contingent upon their property closing. Okay. So if this agreement does not close on the stated closing date for any reason related to financing, included but not limited to, the seller can declare this purchase agreement canceled, in which case this purchase agreement is canceled. Buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be forfeited to seller as liquidated damages. In the alternative, seller may seek all the remedies allowed by law. Now, here's where you go into the next section. If the written statement is not provided by the date specified on line 77, seller may, at seller's option, declare this purchase agreement canceled by written notice to buyer at any time prior to seller receiving the written statement, in which case this purchase agreement is canceled. So that's another interesting thing is we have that date up there, right? But let's say the date was January 15th and the seller didn't call a cancellation, but the lender then provides it on January 17th. What this is stating is now that the seller's received the written statement, they can't call the fact that you didn't provide it on time. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So if the seller wants to proceed with the cancellation because the written statement hasn't been provided yet, they have to call that contingency before a written statement is delivered to them. They can't get a written statement delivered to them after the date and then decide they don't like the fact that it wasn't delivered by the date.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. So, and this is where it's saying who then is going to retain the earnest money if it's not delivered. If the written statement is not provided and seller has not previously canceled this purchase agreement is canceled as of closing date specified in this purchase agreement. Buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation of purchase agreement confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money to be paid to, and again, you check retained by seller, refunded to buyer. I am typically always going to check refunded to buyer because it's what's in the buyer's best interest. But you're going to oftentimes see the sellers to counter back with that. If I'm
And they
in
did that in
multiple,
this case.
yeah. And if I'm in multiple offers, I'm probably going to check that it's retained by sellers because it's one small item that can make your offer a little stronger. And I just explained to buyers, like, I know that that's nerve wracking, but we're really relying on your lender
Mhm.
to do their job.
Well, and didn't you say when we talked about that, Cassie, too, like if you're going to be crossing that bridge, there are other things you can do to maybe work with that so the deal doesn't fall through. Like there's maybe an extension you can get, or
Yeah.
right, you have recourses before the thing blows up.
Right.
If
So
you're
like
proactive
if,
about it.
right. And lenders do not pay attention to this
Right.
at all. So while it is the lender's responsibility to provide that, it's really your responsibility as the buyer's agent to stay on lender for that. So like one of the first things I do when I send them the purchase agreement, yes, our TC team sends the purchase agreements. Old habits die hard. I used to always just send my purchase agreements to the lender. So typically my lenders get it twice. They get it from me the minute I have it executed, and then they get it from the TC team. And when I'm sending it out, I say, hey, there's a written statement date in there by that date. And then I'm constantly following up with the lender to make that happen. To your point, Jen, if it appears that we're not going to have that, then I'm calling the listing agent saying, hey, the lender's not going to be able to make it because of X, Y, Z reasons. I want to do an amendment and extend our written statement date. If they say no and throw a fit, well, then the buyer has to decide what they want to do. Do they want to send a cancellation, or do they want to hope that the lender gets their poop in a group, or you know what I mean? Like, again, cross that bridge when we get there. But if you're having conversation with the lender up front about this written statement date, there should be no reason that they're not able to fulfill their commitment.
Right. But it's our job to follow up with the lender ourselves versus task that, of course, with the buyer, right? Just to be sure
Right.
that I'm not right. Okay.
Yeah. I think, Lydia, do you know, do our TCs, I feel like our TCs are pretty on top of that as well.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
they
would
are.
agree.
Yeah, Kylie reached out to Colin and told him we had a written statement date that was due. And then I reached out to him too, just to reiterate. So she gave him a heads up beforehand and then reached out to him when we didn't receive it specifically on that date. But I also do. And the agent that I was working with was actually he was fine with it, that we were just one day past it. But again, I don't like going past that date, and I just want to stay true to
Yeah.
what we put in there.
Right.
And the
Right.
way to do that is through an amendment. It can't just be I'm guessing so, but it just isn't like a gentleman's agreement where you call up the listing agent and you're like, hey, do you mind if it's like a day or two after that? Oh, no problem. I mean,
It happens all the time,
Oh, okay. So you don't should
but a gentleman's agreement's not going to hold up in court.
exactly.
And like,
The one that I just have right now, he's like, let's just draft up an amendment just so we're
covered.
Yeah.
both covered. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, just imagine going to court and saying, well, the listing agent told me, and the judge is going to look at you and say,
We wrote it on a napkin.
right. Hey, you actually could.
You could, yeah.
I mean, as long as it's in writing and signed by all parties, it'll uphold in court. But, that's kind of like, Parker always calls it my broker brain, and maybe it is, but that's always the mentality I take towards anything, is if this scenario were to go to court, how is a judge going to look at this?
Right.
And sometimes you don't know the answer to that, right? Like, but in a situation like this, think about that. Well, I mean, I had an email that said it was fine, but the judge is going to say, yeah, but that email is between you and the agent, and he's going to shame both you agents, right? Because he's probably going to go with the listing agent and say, why are you speaking on the seller's behalf? And then the list agent says, well, I called them. Do you have proof that how that conversation, you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
it's just always the old saying, you have two hands, cover your ass with both of them.
Right.
So, and Lydia, you get a lot of advice from agents on the team, which is great. Like, I don't want you to feel like you can't. And I don't want this to come off negative, but the problem is some of the seasoned agents are so set in their ways that they do what they've always done because they haven't got burned on it, right? Where like I operate being the broker from my previous brokerage, and just doing as many transactions as I have personally, I've seen a lot over the years, and I've seen the smallest thing cause the biggest issue. So that's why I always approach things with more caution than someone who maybe hasn't been burned on that, right? Like me having to buy that radon mitigation system by checking the wrong box. I double check all of my purchase agreements. That was like 7 years ago. And I double check all of my, specifically that section before I resubmit it to the agent every single damn time, because it took me one time to do that to learn my lesson for life. So, again, I don't want you to feel like you shouldn't go to agents, and I'm not talking poorly about the experienced agents on our team, but there's just some things, again, they do because they've always done it that way because they probably haven't gotten burned on it. But the minute that they do, like for instance, on this at market thing, and I don't know if they still talk about this in licensing school, because again, I did it so long ago and it was much different. They're like, how do they treat, or how do they teach you? Do they teach you LC Dora or old car? Who knows what I'm talking about?
Old car.
Okay. So
Old
when I
car.
was in school, it was LC Dora. Do you know what we're talking about, Lydia?
No.
On your buyer rep agreement, or no, it's under agency, right? Our fiduciary duties,
Agents
loyalty.
relationship.
Yep. Loyalty, disclosure. Do you know what I'm talking about now?
Yeah.
Okay. So those in real estate school, these guys were taught the acronym as old car, a way for you to remember what each one was. And when I went through school, they taught us LC Dora. I mean, look, it's stuck with me all of these years later. I don't even know what my point was with this now. Well,
Some of the seasoned agents and what they were
oh,
doing.
yeah. I mean, also things have evolved and changed so much, right? That like even newer age or even experienced agents are calling me on this change to the purchase agreement because they have a hard time wrapping their heads around it.
It becomes so routine to do it one way, and then to try and change it just as hard.
Yeah, it is. It really is. That's why I don't know if any of you are interested in getting licensed in Wisconsin. I am, and I've only been licensed for a few years, and that was really challenging for me because I was so dead set with Minnesota because I've done it for so long, and Wisconsin is quite different from Minnesota. And I really had a hard time wrapping my head around the distinct differences between Minnesota and Wisconsin. It was a struggle. So I always tell agents, if you want to get licensed in Wisconsin, don't wait 15 to 20 years to do it and have Minnesota so ingrained in your head that you can't even open your brain for new knowledge. All right, you guys, I'm actually super excited about how this went today. I feel like, you had some great questions, and I feel like it's been a great learning environment. I hope you do as well. We didn't get, as far as I thought we did, which is actually good because it means you guys had questions. So we will pick up where we left off next week. Does that sound good?
Sounds great. Thanks so much.
Yeah. And next week, remember, is going to be the noon.
Oh, it is next week. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry, Chris. I don't think I answered that question in your email. I will
okay.
change that on our calendars just for next week, though. It'll be noon.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you guys. See you
Have a
later.
great day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.